we started doing our off-season grades for our favorite ball clubs. Last time actually was on Sox type thing. You well, was that a couple times ago where we actually gave the
That was that
grades?
that was that was 2 episodes
Okay.
ago.
Because you originally had an F for your White Sox, but you upgraded that with the addition of Elvis Andrews.
To an A.
That's absurd, but that's all
No,
right.
to a
You
to
go
a
from
D.
an F to an E for for
Effort.
yeah.
No, I what did I say? I think C minus now or D plus, something like that. But
Well, that's interesting because I gave my Chicago Cubs a C minus actually. And
ah,
I actually wrote a blog piece about this. We haven't blogged in a long time after we started this podcast back in 2019. Uh, this used to be a blog, believe it or not, for close to 10 years where we wrote ridiculous shit. So, but I got into that a little bit again, dabbled in some writing, just kind of collect my thoughts. Because there's a lot going on with the Cubs this offseason. The $300 million spent by Jed Hoyer and Tom Ricketts on the most number of free agents added of any Major League Ball club. But I was reminded of a phrase I first heard from one Dan McNeil on the old afternoon saloon on ESPN Chicago
the good
1000.
old days. I do miss
Yes.
that. I do miss that.
Dan McNeil. He's subsequently been canceled essentially for some ridiculous sexist comments he made on social media. I think he has a podcast now, but I also think he's kind of a caustic personality. I'm not sure he gets along with a lot of people. So it just sort of worked out where he can't fit in any of the radio stations in Chicago, but he's got his podcast still going. But I do remember him once saying, and these words have always stuck with me: do not confuse activity with accomplishment. And that kind of came to mind when I was thinking about the Cubs offseason. And when he says that, that also brings up an example that you and I actually experienced. And I want to see if I can see if you remember any of this, but which might not, neither of us might remember this properly because this is a bachelor party in New Orleans for our buddy Jason back in 2006.
You're talking about the amount of hot dogs consumed by you
Well,
and
it has to do with hot dogs because what was the hot dog cart du jour there? They were all over the place. Was it Demon Dogs or Devil Dogs or something like that?
It's
Devil
Dogs.
Devil
right?
Dogs. Okay, I
Yeah.
knew it was one of because Demon Dogs was a place right off.
That's the place down here.
Right by DePaul. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's Devil Dogs, which was they're red carts all over the place. Fantastic hot dogs. But
we think.
Well, yeah, that we usually hit those up about 2 or 3 in the morning while we were probably halfway through our evening at that point. But I remember one night we walked up to a Devil Dog cart and there was no one manning it. But and apparently I'm assuming he was a homeless person. I don't remember the details correctly, so I'm hoping you remember as much of this or more than I do. But
I love this story.
I believe a homeless person like jumped in behind the Devil Dog cart and started pretending like he was actually going to make us some hot dogs. Maybe he was trying to trick us into like actually paying him for a hot dog as he kind of did a dance and was like moving his arms around, kind of pretending.
He's like, what? All right, you want some onions? You want some onions?
Yeah. Pretending he could actually access the ingredients and the actual hot dogs because it was all locked down. There was just nobody running it. But he was acting like he was actually going to serve us a hot dog. And
he did not.
I feel like that was a perfect example of confusing activity. He was trying to confuse us with his activity versus accomplishment.
Well played. I like where you're going with this because you and I are on the same page on this.
So that's exactly why I brought this story up, and I didn't bring it up during our prep for this podcast because I wanted to see if I could jog your memory and get a chuckle out of you. But
yeah, it's a great story.
There's many other stories of that trip that will not be told in this podcast.
Never.
Well, maybe we'll start another podcast about other drinking stories, but
Tales from the Bottom.
That homeless person who was trying to attempt to confuse us with his activity into thinking it was accomplishing something seems like exactly what Jed Hoyer has been doing this entire offseason for the Chicago Cubs. Like I said, he spent $300 million of Tom Ricketts money on the most free agents of any major league team this offseason, but what has he really accomplished? Yeah, I'll go down the list. I go into great detail in the blog post, and I'll remember as much as I can for this podcast. I don't want to get too deep into the minutia, but of course, the headlines were Dansby Swanson, which is a fine player. 7-year, $177 million contract. He had a 5.7 WAR last year. Defensive stalwart. That's going to be a theme. That is definitely a theme for the Cubs this year. Run prevention. You're going to hear that all over the place as they're seriously making a priority of defense and essentially run prevention over offense. And I'll get
over run scoring.
Yeah. Well, if you can prevent any runs to being scored, all you need is one. So maybe that's what their goal is. There's some merit to that to some degree. So see if that plays out. But the issue I have with Dansby Swanson is it feels like the Cubs got fourth place in the shortstop sweepstakes that we have talked about for years. This is the second year in a row where the shortstop free agent class was tremendous. And I feel like the Cubs had a shot last year and got nobody, and went into it this year and ended up with the fourth place. I want to Trey Turner, and I'm going to sound like a petulant child again. We did this in probably our last episode of In the Hole, where we did our offseason to-do list. I want to Trey Turner because the Cubs are a major market team. I want to Trey Turner because the Cubs are in the third largest market in the country. They have their own television network. There is no reason why they can't be acting with the big boys, spending that kind of money, doing whatever it takes to be in the upper echelon of Major League Baseball. Not just spending, but being that team that you think of, like anytime a free agent becomes available, such as, I don't know, somebody like Shohei Ohtani next year, why the Cubs should not be involved in that. They are a behemoth, yet they have convinced us fans that they are pretty much a middle market team trying to get by on their guile and their brilliant acumen and whatever they have to do, to get by these big boys that they can't compete with in other terms. But it's simply not true.
Smartly. That's what they've been doing. That is spending smartly.
That's propaganda is what I'm arguing. That is an argument to there's nothing wrong with spending smartly. And it's a great mantra, but it doesn't mean that the Cubs are in a situation where they have to play second fiddle to anyone else. And that is what they've sold the public. And that is why I've been basically on a 3-year rant against Tom Ricketts ever since the biblical losses comment. And this is just another example of it, where I think it's fine that they add Dansby Swanson, but that's about all they did. I'll go through the list. They also added Jameson Taillon, 4-year deal, $68 million. Great innings eater. Love it. He's a perfect number 3 in your rotation, where the Cubs have nothing but number 3s, 4s, and 5s in that rotation. Maybe you can call Marcus Stroman a 2. I don't know. I mean, somebody's going to be number 1, 2, but they don't have an ace. They don't have anyone that's considered an ace. And that's unconscionable for a team in the third largest market in the country. Yeah. The Cubs, who have every conceivable advantage. They've turned all of Wrigleyville into Ricketts. This is getting into my name my team territory at the end of the show, but Rickettsville cash machine is what I call Wrigleyville these days. The idea that we're supposed to be impressed with getting Jameson Taillon and Dansby Swanson it's wrong. It's wrong to me. I feel like we're being lied to every time we've been told that we should be excited about that. The other thing is those are the only 2 long-term deals they signed this whole offseason. That is 3/4 of the $300 million they spent. All the other deals they spent is they're all 1-year deals. There's a couple 2-year deals. I think Drew Smiley has a 2-year deal. Might be another 1 or 2 smattered in there, but that's where it gets to the activity versus accomplishment part of my argument. You can point to, well, we spent money. We finally spent some money, which they should have been doing all along. they blame the pandemic for costing them an ability to spend like other teams have, even though no one else has slowed their spending, as we've seen spending skyrocket, including, I believe San Diego is the 29th largest market in the country, yet they are spending up with the Mets.
Yeah,
up with,
we'll get to that in a little
yeah,
bit.
yeah. So it makes me furious every time I hear intelligent spending, trying to thread the needle, those phrases that you've heard from Jed Hoyer. Those are all noble enterprises, and they all make sense for a team like the Tigers or a team like the A's, or middle or small market teams. They have to rely on that. I think all teams should do that, but the Cubs also have a built-in advantage that they're choosing not to take advantage of. They're lying to their fans about it, and that's why I'm furious about all of this. So yeah, they made some solid moves, with the 1-year deals that they made. Michael Fulmer is probably the best of their moves, which was one of the more recent moves they actually made. I was shocked he was still on the market. Actually, he's a potential closer candidate. They got him for $4 million. Is all. Former Tiger, who was emerged as a tremendous back of the bullpen asset. I love that deal. That's great. Those are all supplemental deals. Trey Turner would have been great. Trey Boom Boom Mancini, who's a favorite of mine, cancer survivor, which is tremendous. He's returned fully healthy. He actually was on the world champion Houston Astros, helped them contribute to that championship. Love that signing. The problem is they signed Eric Hosmer before that, which makes almost no sense to me. He ended up with decent numbers by the end. I think he had a 1.2 WAR at the end of the season, but Eric Hosmer he's done. I mean, maybe his defense is still there, but he's not an offensive threat.
Nope.
Yet the Cubs are selling the public on, what kind of moves they're making in the offseason, including Eric Hosmer. I mentioned Drew Smiley. I love the guy. He's a number 4 pitcher. That's great. They signed a number 4 for some pitching depth. This is where my obnoxious, petulant child to-do list that we did in the last episode. I wanted Verlander. I wanted Jacob deGrom. Why can't they sign all these? And if those guys get hurt or they become too old too fast, buy somebody else next year. Figure it out. They have the resources, and they're trying to tell us they don't. Play. A lot of this is from, we're seeing the opposite end of this with Stephen Cohen with the Mets, which I think they've made some hilarious mistakes and
continue to.
Yeah, they will always, because they are the New York Mets. But you cannot doubt the sincerity and the effort of their owner. I mean, he's throwing everything at that. Of course, he has more resources than anyone else in the world, pretty much. So that's a bit unfair, but we're talking about billionaires, and don't let anyone fool you. Tom Ricketts is a billionaire and a multi-billionaire, and they can throw money at the problem if they need to. They're choosing not to and telling us they are. That's what really frustrates me about this specifically. I didn't talk about Cody Bellinger. $17.5 million 1 year. This goes back to run prevention, because he is a tremendous center fielder.
He is a tremendous center fielder who forgot how to hit along the way.
Somehow a former MVP completely forgot how to hit.
35 homers that year or something, yeah. Was it 38?
He had a 78 OPS plus, where 100 is average in the majors. Yeah. I mean, maybe the problem was the Dodgers. Dodgers have consistently fallen short in many areas in the postseason specifically, but I think the Cubs are hoping that he can find that swing again. But really, they're banking on his run prevention. Tucker Barnhart is the catcher.
Ooh, Tucker Barnhart.
I do. He was underwhelming as a Tiger. I was sold. I was not waiting for any kind of huge offensive production. I was sold on. They sold him on the idea that his defense was going to be what was a real asset. I didn't see it in a season in Detroit. He certainly wasn't throwing out many runners. It's hard to quantify pitch calling and the assurance that pitch framing and all that. It's hard to quantify that necessarily, but I could definitely tell you throwing out runners was not something he's good at anymore, and he was not impressive on hitting the baseball at all. So I don't expect much out of him. He's essentially a backup catcher for behind Young Gomes for the Cubs. So that was supposed to impress us. I'm probably forgetting a few others. Brad Boxberger is a solid reliever for I think $2.5 million for a year, but all these deals are 1-year deals that they're out from underneath after the season. In fact, $70 million comes off the books next year for the Cubs. So I feel like they're really, throwing some money at the problem, not really accomplishing much other than getting some buzz, fooling some people into thinking they're really going for it. Where I think the real goal of this offseason was to try to put at least a respectable Major League Baseball product on the field for their marquee network, because the ratings for marquee are in the toilet. They have dropped incredibly since their first season because nobody gives a fuck about the 4A players they've been putting on the field for 3 years, almost 3 years now. That I think is the crux of why they finally decided, we've got to spend $300 million here so we can make $500 million in TV revenue finally, because no one's tuning into this shit product we're putting on the field. If we have some actual major leaguers that people recognize their names, maybe some people will tune in and we'll sell some advertising. I think that is my cynical view of this entire offseason, because there was no reason to watch the Cubs for certainly this past season. You could root for Christopher Morel and Patrick Wisdom, Frank Schwindel. That's fun for if you're in a small market, rooting for your call-ups. These were 4A players that the Cubs were banking on for the last 2 years, and it's embarrassing. And I think this is an initial reaction to that. I'm hoping that this is the first step in a real plan to actually field a competitive team next year, because I don't think it's going to be competitive this. I think Pacoda, we've gone back and forth about the validity of Pacoda, and everyone can have their own opinions about it. I think they have the Cubs at 78 wins this year. I think that sounds pretty much right. I'd have them at 75 to 80 at the most. The high end would be 80, which is game under 500. So I think mid 70s is about right, and that's after spending $300 million on free agents. So I think that kind of tells you, not necessarily empirically, but unbiasedly at least, that tells you how much activity they've done and how little they've accomplished.
Yeah, I think someone forgot to tell Jed Hoyer that the unbalanced schedule does not exist anymore, because I think he put a team together that is probably somewhat competitive within the division.
Yeah, it could beat up on the Pirates and Reds for sure.
But the problem is you got to play everybody now. You're not gonna get those 18 games against some bottom feeder anymore.
Yep.
And that's not gonna bode well for them, or probably a lot of teams. And it's why some of the teams, I think that's why Pacoda, like, these have come out and we're like, oh, some of these projections seem low, but obviously they're adjusted too, because from years past, because you don't have this unbalanced schedule anymore. Mm-hmm. So you're playing some big boys twice, that you might only see once or not at all. So
that's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out, because I didn't really even consider that. I'm sure many have, but it makes sense. That's going to be a very different dynamic.
Yeah. There's not going to be that,
especially for our central divisions that you and I are focused on, because we're typically the weakest division.
Exactly. So,
and, if my Tigers or my Cubs or your White Sox have a solid team, they can pretty much bank on beating the fuck out of the lower end of that division, but that's going to be harder to pile up those wins when you're only playing them 12 times instead of 19.
I'm also thinking we're looking at the possibility of both central divisions having a team with a not so good record, but being the division winner going into the playoffs because and only having one team coming out of that. But
yeah, they could be a lot worse records.
Yeah, we'll see how it all plays out.
Maybe the Cubs will win the division with 78 wins.
Well, that's what. Yeah, exactly. You'd never know. That's how fucked up this is. So
I think our next episode 119, I think we'll do our preseason predictions that we do every year.
For a good laugh.
Yeah, for a good laugh. The best part is that we can I think last year we recapped our predictions. That made a whole episode making fun of ourselves. So
yeah, it was a pretty funny episode too. There wasn't a lot right. The Nostradamus episode.
That's what it is. Yes, Nostradamus.
But I will tell you, I gave the Cubs a C, like way back when we were going to do this show, and I'm with you. What I was disappointed at, not that I'm a Cubs fan, but as just I don't know, it's more exciting when one team is trending up in Chicago. It makes for better banter.
Mm-hmm. Well, the best is when they're both up, but
no, right. But the fact of the matter is we heard that they had the resources to spend. And when you hear that in a major market, that usually means you land 2 or 3 of the top guys.
Yeah. They spent for sure.
Not one of, as you put it, 4th place shortstop in the pool. And
it's
then
not even the bronze medal.
And a bunch of like fillers.
Yeah.
I mean, really.
I think some are solid, but they're not committed to anybody but those two, Tyone and Swanson. So
and I hate to say it, it reminds me of the continued rebuilding years where they did all the 1-year deals so they could trade away for assets at the trade deadline.
Yep. That's their plan. They're hoping to catch lightning in a bottle. The most annoying phrase in baseball. And I think it was the White Sox strategy for 80 some years, but sorry, I had to get that jab in there, but but they're hoping at the same time, maybe Bellinger, they'll figure out what was wrong with Bellinger that the Dodgers couldn't figure out. And all of a sudden they have an MVP candidate there and they can compete in a mediocre division. Although I don't understand how the Cardinals are going to keep being good with the rotation they have, but somehow I think they will, but we'll get into that next episode.
Real quick before we move up to Cubs. Next Cub has gone to the Cardinals as a catcher.
I wasn't even going to bring that up. I've moved on.
Who's had some disparaging remarks against the Cubs organization. Now, this is a player I always thought.
You're speaking of Wilson Contreras.
That is correct. Yeah, Wilson Contreras, who I've sort of pegged as a loudmouth, sort of annoying person, player. I never really liked Wilson Contreras. So I just wonder how you feel about Wilson Contreras now that he's sounded off about the Cardinals being such a greater organization than the Chicago Cubs.
I could see exactly why he would say that. I could see why he'd be very miffed at the Cubs for not signing him or any of the golden generation of the Chicago Cubs. Why wouldn't he be pissed off? I think the idea that he went to the St. Louis Cardinals, their arch rivals, is putting it right back in the face of the Cubs. I'm not angry with him. I'm not angry with anybody that signs, wherever makes the most sense for them financially, for their family. I have my suspicions that Chicago's a much better place for anyone. So I'm not sure, other than spite, why he signed with the Cardinals. But hey, to each his own. If that's, I mean, we're major league a-holes here, so well, I can't judge anyone against for their spite, I guess. But I'm kind of sick of hearing about him. He's not a Cub anymore. It keeps coming up on different Cubs podcasts or other things on social media and stuff. It's like, move on. He's not on the team anymore, and the Cubs chose not to have him. I think he wants to be here is why he's making spiteful comments. He didn't want to leave. And I don't blame him. So I guess overall, I don't blame him. I don't really care anymore. I wish him the best. I don't have a problem with him personally, the way you do. Apparently, I didn't know this before, that you never liked him, but he's probably going to be a pain in the ass for the Cubs somehow. I did not want the Cubs to re-sign him. I at least to a long-term deal. I'd be happy. I was happy if the Cubs could have gotten him for a year or two. That is certainly not what he was interested in, and I can't blame him, but I also can't blame the Cubs because catchers on the other side of 30 years old typically don't age well.
Nope.
And even though we have the DH now, signing a long-term deal for a DH doesn't make sense to me. So I understand why the positions of both parties. It's a bit immature on his part to be spiteful in the media. He doesn't need to talk about the Cubs ever again. But he can if he chooses. I'm not going to hold it against him. Maybe it'll turn into some spiciness during the Cubs Cardinals series for the next several years. That's entertaining to me. Great. I don't hold a grudge against him. I kind of just don't want to even talk about it anymore.
All right. Well, let's move on then. How about we talk some Giant? Oh, well, you got some more? Or go ahead.
I do want to back up to Dansby Swanson for a second, and you're going to like this. The other point I failed to make that I did bring up in my blog post, but it feels eerily reminiscent. The number of years, the dollar amounts, almost.
Oh God.
His age, his promise, the idea that he came up with the Atlanta Braves.
Oh God, I know where this is going.
His defensive prowess.
This sounds really familiar.
This is all what we were sold on to get Jason Hayward.
I was gonna say, is he good at speeches?
Well, that's if you read my blog post, which apparently you didn't.
No, I don't read. I'm from the South Side.
That's right. That was the analogy. That's how I ended that section of it about Dansby. I'm like, well, maybe he's really good at speeches, team speeches in the locker room during rain delays in Game 7 of the World Series. I just feel if you look at the profile of both those players at this time when they signed these deals, it seems very, very similar to me. And especially that we were banking on the defense a lot, and the potential for the offense was there, and it was about the Cubs were banking on that was going to explode with Hayward. And we've seen an uptrend in Dansby Swanson's numbers. Again, he had the 5.7 WAR last year. But a lot of that was on defense, and he did have I forgot the number of home runs. It was an impressive number of home runs, but I'm worried. He has one hit in the spring so far. One hit.
It's the spring.
I know it's the spring, and I'm being hypocritical already, but I'll use it against him when I don't use it for anybody. But you sign a guy for 7 years, $177 million. You hope he has more than one hit all spring, I guess. So I think that he's going to be, he's going to have a microscope on him. And it even sounds like this wasn't his first choice to come.
I read that article. Yeah.
So
I do read a little.
He gave the great speech the day he was signed and did his press conference talking about how his grandpa was a Cubs fan and how he always wanted to be here. And that sounds kind of like bullshit to me the more that comes out. So I'm a little nervous about all of this. So that's another layer on top of this to the person they committed the most years and money to. Makes me a little nervous. So.
Yeah, I think that comment too about like he was hesitant to come to the Cubs because he wanted to go to some place where he could be winning. So like, yikes.
Well, he won fourth prize just like the Cubs did.
Right, it's a swap. It's an even swap.
Yeah, I mean it's a weird way to start a marriage. So we'll see how that pans out. I could be wrong about all this. Maybe they will catch lightning in a bottle and everything will pan out the way Jed was planning all along. But I think that would be luck more than anything.
I had a marriage start out weird. I'm divorced now. So there you go.
Sorry about that.
No, it was low hanging fruit. I just thought I'd use that. It really didn't start off weird. It's funny. Ended horribly though, but let's move on.
Quickly, please.
Word Hole Media.